That is the fundamental problem of AI, because if you think from an environmental point of view, we want less. Tesla, they try to do their windshield wipers with a front camera that detects whether or not there's rain. You don't need a very complex neural network in the back to establish if it's raining or not.
Welcome to a new episode of XR and AI Spotlight, the show where we give the stage to the founders and makers who are pushing the boundaries of XR and AI. My name is Gabriele Romagnoli, I'm your host, and I'm here today with Alex de Vries. Alex is a PhD candidate at the VU Amsterdam School of Business and Economics and a founder of Digiconomist, a research company dedicated to exposing the unintended consequences of digital trends. His research focuses on the environmental impact of emerging technology and has played a pivotal role in the global discussion regarding sustainability of blockchain technology and artificial intelligence. Listen to this episode and you will learn the real challenges when trying to quantify the environmental impact of AI.
Even if you get a number for potential energy consumption, there's no way to get any details on what might be the environmental footprint of all that energy consumption. The bad news is we're actually going backward in terms of transparency. We already have very little data to work with, and it's just getting worse.
How the training of a model has actually less impact than what you might think.
Running this model, it's likely costing OpenAI 500 to 600 megawatt hours a day. In just a matter of 3 days, they would already spend more on actually running this model.
And the alarming projection of AI energy consumption over the next 2 years.
I looked at how the supply chain for AI servers can expand in the coming years. If you do that for just a little bit into the future, the next 2 or 3 years, you see that a single high-end AI server will consume as.
But before we get into it, I want to thank our sponsor Meshi, who made this episode possible. Meshi is a real powerhouse for generating 3D assets with AI. You can start with a simple text or image prompt and get high-quality, stylized model in just a minute. One feature that I personally love is the ability to create stylized textures for any mesh, with or without UV, and since the release of Meshing 2.5, pro users can even edit only section of the generated textures with just a text prompt. Try it out, go to meshi.ai, start the 7 days trial, and after that, use the code XRAI20 to get 20% off your subscription. And now it's time to roll the title and welcome Alex under the spotlight. Alex, it is a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So look, Alex, I've read your recent article, and I would like to start with what seems like a broader question, and is, how can we measure the environmental cost of AI?
It's not easy. This is a pretty tricky thing, because ultimately you need data. You need to know very simple stuff like how much energy is being consumed here, and then apart from that you also want to focus on other materials, but just the energy is already a big challenge, because the end users of AI related hardware are not really disclosing much about what they are doing with it and how much they're consuming for whatever they're doing with AI hardware. The thing that I did in my own research, I really looked at the supply chain of high-end AI servers to get some sense of direction for how the energy consumptions related to those devices might develop in the coming years. But in all honesty, even if you get a number for potential energy consumption, there's no way to get any confirmation on that, and more importantly, there is no way to get any details on what might be the environmental footprint of all that energy consumption, because as long as you don't know where those machines are going, you can't say anything about what the carbon footprint is going to be. Are those machines going to be powered by wind or solar power, fossil fuels? You don't know.
So maybe if we take a step back, right, and we look at when we measure about energy, the first thing that comes to mind is the energy needed to train these models, right? This is one of the first thing, and usually what the conversation revolves around. So what are some of the things that you have found in your research?
Yeah, people ask me all the time, what makes AI so energy intensive? Well, in essence, AI does not have to be energy intensive. Like ultimately, whatever you're doing with AI, you're always typically going to be building some kind of model. You're going to be training a model. Hey, you're going to be defining a certain amount of parameters, which is an arbitrary decision, and then you're going to feed your model an arbitrary amount of data depending on what you're doing. It's all dependent on what application you're building. So, hey, in the case of ChatGPT, you're building a large language model, you're going to feed it a lot of text. You're going to be training that model, and you're going to be operating that model. But you can do it small scale, you can do it large scale. But the thing with AI is, in general, bigger is better. And this is where the problem starts. If you're doing AI, if you make a bigger model, the bigger model will always perform better. It will be more robust, it will perform better, and a better performing model will ultimately give you the best position in the market, attract the most users, have the most revenue. So there is an economic incentive to blow up the size of these models. And I think that is the fundamental problem of AI, because if you think from an environmental point of view or an energy point of view, we want less. We want to consume less power, because less power is ultimately beneficial to the environment. We are reducing our strain on the power grids, and ultimately reduce our carbon emissions that way. But yeah, in AI, generally speaking, bigger is better. So there's a very big incentive for anyone who's working with AI to make those models extremely large. But if you have a very large model, yeah, of course, you're going to be needing more computational resources and thus power to run those models as well. And that's where it starts to hurt.
And when it starts to hurt, you're referring about the usage of the model or the training of the model? Because that is another interesting point, right? The initial training of the model is something that is energy intensive. Curious, maybe if you get some ballpark number of comparison to let's say the common folks, let me understand.
Yeah.
Then there is the phase of inference, right? When I ask a random question to the model, and that also consumes energy. So can you maybe unpack that for us?
I said it starts to hurt because if you make a really large model and no one uses it, then of course you don't necessarily have a very big problem. Of course you spend resources on training, but then at least it's not an ongoing concern. Before ChatGPT, this was actually very common. We would spend a lot of resources on training AI models, and typically there would be no adoption. Most people would never use those models, so all the energy consumption was in training, and then not so much in what we call the inference, the operational stage of AI. With ChatGPT, everything was turned upside down. When ChatGPT launched, it was reaching mass adoption in a record amount of time, infamously getting to 100 million users in just 2 months. That was unprecedented. And the thing is, all of the sudden, we start to realize that if you have to serve this massive model that you build to all those users on a daily basis, then the power cost of that stage is actually way higher than the training. So I quantified in my article that training the original GPT-3 model on which ChatGPT was originally based was probably taking somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 megawatt hours of electricity. But running this model, running ChatGPT on a daily basis, considering ChatGPT is already a derivative, it's likely costing OpenAI, or was likely costing OpenAI 500 to 600 megawatt hours a day. So in just a matter of 3 days, they would already spend more on actually running this model than it took. So I think if there is mass adoption, the training is not so big. And of course, if there is no adoption, then the training is the biggest part. But now we're in a new phase. With ChatGPT, we ended in a new stage where people actually make use of these really large models, and that turns things upside down.
So this is a very good point, right? And I was also curious if when you, let's say, look at those numbers, what was included in those numbers? So in a sense, when we look at the usage of ChatGPT, for example, does that include the API calls from the thousands of tools that get from it, or just the usage of ChatGPT on the web browser? Just to understand also the scale of what is accessible and what we can use in order to quantify, as you said at the beginning, this kind of
Yeah, this was actually just looking at the servers that OpenAI is running in the background. Hey, and when you're doing this type of analysis, you should account for all kinds of things, including, for example, the device on which you're opening ChatGPT. Are you running it on your phone, on a desktop? Those things, of course, also add to the electricity consumption ultimately of the whole interaction with ChatGPT. But in this case, we're just talking about the electricity consumption of OpenAI servers.
Okay. So then that means that the scale could even be bigger than what we roughly.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you start to account for everything, you need, you start accounting for life cycle costs. So you include, for example, the energy consumption for manufacturing those machines. You start including the devices on the user side, and not just on the supplier side, but also on the user side. Anything in between. It all adds up. But even if we just look at the OpenAI servers themselves, the numbers already get quite big.
Yeah. And this is another point, because we talk about large language model, but we know when we talk about AI and generative AI, we also talk about other forms of output, right? Of course, we are talking about images, video, and something that is going to also evolve. Like we now have 3D generative AI models. We are moving into word building just with AI.
Yeah.
So, do you have any insights regarding other type of output when it comes to the impact that might have on the environment?
Yeah, well, I think generally when you're using AI, you're going to be making an application and more energy intensive. And I don't necessarily have the numbers on those other applications, but what I did do is I quantified the difference between, for example, a standard Google search versus a ChatGPT interaction. And in my article, I show that for a standard Google search, the typical energy consumption is maybe 0.3 watt hours, while for a ChatGPT interaction, this is up to 6 watt hours per interaction. And a lot of people might wonder, okay, what does 6 watt hours mean? Well, 6 watt hours is like a low lumen LED bulb that you have active for 1 hour. In itself, it's not so much, but if you think about the scale at which this is happening, so I also put in my article, suppose we would turn Google into ChatGPT today, and every Google user would be using it that way. And then we're talking about 9 billion interactions per day. And then, of course, those numbers start to add up. And I concluded that, okay, if we turn Google into ChatGPT today, we would actually probably need as much power as Ireland just to run the Google search engine.
So this makes me think, right? Because I've also done a little bit of research, and I've seen some articles, and then it's always hard because, as you mentioned, finding the source data, verifying that it also very tricky, and it also ends up, let's say, sensationalizing and something that is maybe not based on truth. But when we look at images, I've read an article saying, well, every image costs as much as a charge of your phone. Now, if we imagine how many images as well then are made, then is also, again, something that scales to a level that can be very, let's say, I wouldn't say threatening, but something that we need to take into account, because then images is 1 frame. Is video then 24 times that per every seconds, having a 24 frame per seconds video output? So, and same for others. So how do you see these actually having, when you look at this and when you look at environmental impact from a broader perspective, right? How big is this? So do you think that this in the upcoming years could be significant. That should be something that we need to tackle right now. How do you see this moving forward?
Yeah, I've been researching cryptocurrency mining for the past couple of years, and I've been doing that since 2016. And I noticed that especially since 2017, 2018, up to recently, that the energy consumption relating to that activity, cryptocurrency mining, has grown from almost nothing to 0.5% of global electricity consumption. And that sounds a little bit, but if you put it in the context of data centers, in the past decade, data centers were responsible for 1% of global electricity consumption. So relative to all other data centers, in a record amount of time, we suddenly added 50% on top of that just through cryptocurrency mining. Now, with AI, we are at the start of a very similar growth curve. I looked at how the supply chain for AI servers can expand in the coming years. And right now, the demand for AI service is so high that you don't even have to consider demand. You can just look at what is going to be the capabilities of the supply chain in the near future, and what is the energy consumption potential of the machines coming from that supply chain. And if you do that for just a little bit into the future, the next 2 or 3 years, you see that because these machines are in themselves already extremely energy hungry, a single high-end AI server will consume as much power as a handful of US households combined. And for a European household, a typical European household, maybe a dozen European households combined per single server. So if you have hundreds of thousands of these machines coming from the production lines, the numbers start to add up quickly. And I estimate that by the year 2027, all these machines could have a power requirement that is equivalent to that of my home country, the Netherlands. Then you're actually talking about the same impact that cryptocurrency mining is already having today. So you're actually adding another 50% on top of historical data center power demand. That is a tremendous amount.
So I want to go into what are the thoughts in mitigating, regulating. I mean, there could be different strategy of addressing this. Before going there, I was wondering also, what is maybe the role of the big tech, right? You mentioned about a Google search that could immediately implement AI search in that and lead to significant consequences. I'm talking about OpenAI. So from the people and companies that are building this model, what do you think is their role?
Well, they probably have a role in making sure that we have a responsible use of AI. But what we see is that these the chairmen of these companies are saying very interesting things in public. Like, for example, Alphabet's chairman was saying in public, okay, if we're going to do AI in every Google search, then our energy consumption will go up by at least tenfold. And if you listen to Sam Altman of OpenAI, he even said, okay, if we continue down this path, we're going to need a breakthrough in nuclear fusion just to be able to continue powering all of this. So they are aware that this is a very energy-intensive technology, and that this is if this is really the path we're going on, this is not going to be sustainable. But at the same time, they're doing very little to stop it. We can also see that the responses to my research, for example, have been for example, I think NVIDIA was asked about this, and NVIDIA said, oh, don't worry, hardware will become more efficient, and that will solve the problem. Okay, well, that's very optimistic, because the problem with AI is, like I already said, bigger is better. You can give companies a more efficient AI server, but there is a very big chance that the only thing they will do is just get more servers, because now it's cheaper for them to have more machines. So this probably will not work out. So there's a lot of, and I also noticed that these big tech companies were also saying, oh, okay, it's energy intensive in the background, but we get so much benefit from all of this that will just offset all of that.
That is okay. So these are all good points you made. So there is one thing I want to catch on what you said. So the first is NVIDIA, and NVIDIA I think it has a different role in this. Or let's see, chip manufacturer, right? The providers of compute. One thing that I personally think that this big tech should start with is at least provide a transparent overview of this energy consumption, right? Of what we use it, how much this is generating, how much this costs, because that feels like at least the first step to start really making an assessment that is not just purely based on guesses but it's something based on facts. So if OpenAI provides, okay, this is what it consumes, this is what an image consumes, this is what a prompt, this is what a training of the model, and so on. I think this would be like already a start, because without understanding, it's very hard to mitigate it, because they could always say, oh yeah, but it remains always this blurry thing. I think that transparency should be the first step.
Yes, absolutely. And the bad news is we're actually going backward in terms of transparency. We already have very little data to work with, and it's just getting worse. And because now there is mass adoption of AI, the electricity cost of operating AI is also going through the roof. But this is interesting information for your competitors. This is concerning your power bill, your costs. So a lot of companies are suddenly refusing to disclose this type of information because they don't want to. They don't want to give that information to their competition either. And in the meanwhile, from a researcher perspective, this is a terrible development, because we already were short on information, and now it's even harder. I looked at the supply chain of these machines at NVIDIA, the production capabilities of NVIDIA in the coming year. But even though that can give you a sense of direction for where things might be going, there are a lot of things you can't get from that. And you have to realize that NVIDIA will never disclose who they are selling to. This is client confidentiality, and they can't be forced to disclose that. So this will not come from NVIDIA. And even if NVIDIA was willing to say, like, hey, we sold this many servers to Google, where did Google put those machines? You still need to know where those machines are to be able to figure out things like, okay, what type of power is going into those machines? Like, how much extra power is required to keep those machines cool? But it really depends on what part of the world you put your device and how you do your data center setup. It needs to come from the companies like Google and OpenAI. And like I just said, they are actually going backward in terms of what they're disclosing. They're not providing more data, they're providing less, as the data is becoming increasingly more sensitive. So I think this actually creates a bit of a requirement for policymakers to start acting, because, we as researchers, we do need data. And it's really hard to say anything about the actual size of what's going on if you don't have data. And if companies are not willing to provide that data, then there's always regulation policies that can nudge them in that direction. But yeah, I mean, this will take a long time. If you look at cryptocurrencies, I mentioned that this has becoming a problem since 2018. We're only seeing disclosure requirements being introduced in Europe right now. Actually, that's still being finalized. There's this new markets in crypto assets regulation that will require anyone that, for example, offers Bitcoin in Europe to disclose something about the environmental impacts of Bitcoin on their website. This is already 6 years later. So if we start thinking about this today for AI, then maybe by the year 2030, we can have some disclosure requirements for AI, and then we don't have any actions yet. Then we just get the data, but then we still need to define the action. So this is I don't have an easy solution. I do know that we need more data, but the path to getting more data is a complicated one.
I just wanted to have a quick break to remind you that the recording of these episodes and many more great conversations with incredible experts are available on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Just head over to my profile or in the episode description below and pick the platform you prefer. And now, let's get back to the show. So, now, it feels sometimes that we are treating the cryptocurrency and, let's say, AI or this new technology as something like a completely, like a brand new case, like there was never happened anything like this before. But I wonder, is there something in history of human beings, of humankind, when with other technologies that have been implemented, there was this this behavior of companies to be secretives, and we kind of like unlocked it, we found a solution? Can we learn from other examples that were in the past on how we can, for example, gather more data or regulate it and not reinvent the wheel every time?
Well, it kind of depends on what you want to see. I mean, in the end, if you want to analyze data centers, there are ways to do that. We can kind of figure out where certain data centers are, how much power they're consuming. We can even figure out where the power is coming from. The problem here is that you're also trying to look inside the data center. You're trying to figure out what is the power demand of a very specific activity that's going on inside the data center. If you think about it, whether you're running regular data center hardware, you're running AI hardware, or cryptocurrency minings for that matter, that can all happen within the same location. In fact, it often does. A lot of times we see co-location of this type of operations. A data center is like a really big black box. You don't really know what's going on inside. So you can do analysis on the outside, but if you don't know what's inside the data center, if you want to know specifically what's going on for AI, then you need at a very granular level which machines are running at what times in that data center in order to be able to figure that out. And that I think that is something with cryptocurrency mining and now AI, we're introducing very, very specific technologies that have really unique characteristics. They really have economic incentives for people who work with this technology to keep using more and more resources. That's something that is unique to, well, it was unique to cryptocurrency mining. Now we're actually seeing something similar. You have to be careful with comparing cryptocurrency mining to AI, but there is something similar in the economic incentives there. And in order to figure out exactly what's going on, you need very granular data. But maybe in the past, this was a lot easier because, if you look at steel manufacturing, okay, there's a factory somewhere.
I think you're right. And I'm not looking for an easy solution because probably there isn't. It's more like thinking, and maybe I'm making also the wrong assumption here. But if we think about algorithms, right? For example, for social media, in that case, that is also very secretive. You really need to be in there in order to understand it, in order to see the impact that they might have. But yet we are trying, right? We are making progress, let's say, in understanding more how they works, in understanding more their recommendations, and that's something also that is proprietary of that specific company, right? Whatever that might be. So this is a bit, the question is like, is there something that we can learn maybe from how we deal with secretive data from companies and how they could disclose it? And yeah, it's not even a question. It's more like a thought.
I mean, in the end, it's all about creating a level playing field. If everyone is forced to disclose a certain type of information, then everyone will do it, and it's fair because everyone is doing it. So, I mean, the disclosure is nothing new. That's something we have been doing for decades already, and also environmental disclosure specifically is not a new thing. I must say that when it comes to environmental disclosure, there's still a lot of freedom in there. There are certain standards that apply, but let's say it's also not it's not a completely unknown area. And environmental disclosure, it does exist. And now that can be used as a blueprint for what we might do for AI.
So there was also one thing that you mentioned earlier in our conversation was about the bigger the better, right? Because AI has the tendency that the more you throw at it, the better it gets.
Yeah.
Now, I was wondering if, again, and this could be my thought and might be, again, wrong, but when we look at, for example, are there models that are maybe smaller and more specialized that could perform a task better than a very big general model? Or are there other ways? And this is, for example, both from the training and from the inference, right? From asking to that model. So would a smaller model perform better and consume less energy when training it or asking? Or what about, for example, other ways like recycling the answer from similar queries that were used in that model? So is this something that's completely unthinkable in terms of lowering the impact?
Yeah, I mean, if bigger is better is generally true, the opposite is also true. The smaller, the worse. So, if you can make smaller models, no problem. But the issue is that the outcomes of those models are going to be way inferior to their bigger counterparts. Well, if you're
even if it's a specialized model for a specific task.
Yeah, ultimately this kind of depends on what type of what are the market circumstances. Like when you're in a market with extremely fierce competition, no one is going to go for a small model because that will put you behind the competition in terms of performance. If you're in a market where there's already no competition, then there is not so necessarily an incentive to keep making your model bigger and bigger. So it's ultimately kind of dependent on circumstances. But I think in a highly competitive market, you just don't have a choice. Like everyone is really pushing their models, and then introducing a smaller model will only result in you getting kicked out of the market. You won't make it. You're not going to survive. And of course, you can have significant model improvements. You might be able to find something that allows you to significantly increase the energy consumption or energy efficiency of your model. Sorry, wrong. But the thing is, if someone achieves this again in a highly competitive market, this will just incentivize that player to make their models even bigger than before, to the point where they ultimately need the same amount of computational resources as before. So I think there's a lot of things are possible, but only if there is like no competition in a certain market. And this is actually in cryptocurrency mining, you see the same thing. Cryptocurrency mining is highly competitive, and miners just continue to add more machines as long as it's profitable to do so. I said before, you can't really compare them, but the dynamics are sort of similar. So, if ultimately there was let's say like a Google search for AI, like one player gets so dominant that no one can compete with it anymore, even if they make a better model. not necessarily always the best one wins, and then of course it could become a different story. But like right now, the only thing we know for certain is that if you make a bigger model, is going to perform better. It's also going to use more resources, and we have yet to see where this ends.
Yeah, it's even interesting because I always thought that competition is a good thing. There are no bad consequences for competition, but in this case, it seems a bit counterintuitive. Like the fact that there is competition.
Actually, like I was saying, you might find yourself in certain situations where making the models bigger is not necessarily required anymore, but then you're probably dealing with a player that has too much power in a certain market, and that's actually not desirable from a competitive point of view. So you might gain environmental benefit, but then you just then you might be dealing with this way too powerful entity in a certain market. Like Google dominates the search market is not ideal.
Yeah. We have briefly also, you mentioned about the positive impact about AI, right? Because that is also the other side of things. I mean, there is just a pure energy consumption, but there is certainly potential for AI to help us solve some of these environmental problems. So maybe what is this positive impact? Is that something that has been measured? Can we quantify it as well?
Yeah, this is very tricky, but this is ultimately what really sets AI apart from cryptocurrency mining, because cryptocurrency mining, previously you have machines doing a lot of computations and everything is just thrown away, nothing stored. That's it. In AI, you're building a model. That model can do something. That model can help you to make certain goods and services more efficiently. And this happens. I mean, this totally happens. We are capable of using AI to make certain goods and services more efficient. This is already happening, for example, in you have machine-assisted translating services nowadays, or AI-assisted translating services, where the AI does the first iteration and then a human does the second time. This helps to save cost, but and then the tricky part is you can actually quantify your savings on your individual service. But what we're interested in is like, what is the net effect of all this energy savings in total? And you can wonder whether there's even going to be any improvement at all in your resource consumption because of something that is known as Jevons paradox. There was this economist in the year 1865, William Jevons, who observed back in that time that as the production of coal was getting more efficient, people started using more of it. It got cheaper, so demand went up. People started using more, and actually, in the end, people were using more coal in total than before. And this is known as Jevons paradox. And this effect is something that we observe throughout the whole history of technological change. So we make goods and services cheaper, but at the same time, as those services become cheaper, this is an economic effect, and demand for those goods and services also go up. And then ultimately, you might be consuming more resources than before. If you think about it in really simple terms, ever since this was first observed, over the past 150 years, or 160 years now almost, we see that the whole history of technological change and automation has that has taken place has not made humans obsolete. In fact, despite all this change, we now have more jobs than ever before. So we are capable of changing what we are doing. There are certain jobs that don't exist anymore today, but at the same time, we're not capable of making humans obsolete. And we actually have more jobs than ever before. And I think this is also a very typical example of ultimately the Jevons paradox. And this is why we should always be cautious when people say like, okay, AI is energy intensive, but the benefit of the applications will offset the extra power that we need on the back end. That's not a guarantee. In fact, it can be the opposite.
No, but this is true. And I don't think that this should be taken as a justification, which is, oh, yeah, we can keep not regulating or not keeping track of this because anyway, it's going to offset. I don't think that this is the right approach. I think it's crazy.
And you asked if you asked if this can be quantified, but I think this is more what I described as more of a guiding principle. You can never really quantify it, and certainly not upfront, but it's more like a guiding principle that you should be keeping in mind.
The only difference that I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's a bit, and in this case, the ramification of it would be 100% true if the effect of if we would use AI then to improve the energy consumption on generating AI models, then we would have this circle, like the example you made for the coal. Now, in this case, the ramification of how AI is used could go from energy grid, could be to autonomous vehicles, could be to many other solutions that has ramification in many other sides. So, and I think it has to be, if even hard to quantify, I think it's still important to take into account is what is the positive impact, because only knowing also what is on the other side of the scale, you can make you can make an assessment if are we really spending too much energy for creating this. It's really energy intensive up to a point where we don't see any benefit from it, because that could also harm progress in a way. We say no, we should stop it. Everything should be regulated. Nothing should the opposite side of the scale.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's lots of things. Huh? I mean, you will have some positive impacts, but also some unique negative impacts. Like, for example, deep fakes. Huh? That's something that is a pretty unique negative to AI as well. And weighing all that is extremely complicated. I think the only certainty that you have is that AI is just generally energy intensive technology. And I think when earlier during this conversation talked about what is the responsibility of companies when it comes to AI, and I think I said, like, okay, ultimately it's their responsibility to just manage this properly. I mean, we see a lot of in the current hype, we see that these companies are just trying to put AI into whatever application, regardless of not whether that's a good idea. It's a lot of fear missing out. It's hype. I have been through a long history of emerging technologies. It's kind of always the same. You always see this effect. And then in the end, we start realizing that, when you have a hammer, every problem is a nail. This is not how you should be approaching things. If you have a problem, you should try to find the best fit solution for that problem, rather than try to force fit AI to solve every single problem. It's not a miracle cure for everything. It has plenty of limitations. And I think a big part of the responsibility of companies is also to make sure that they build solutions that make sense. Don't try to kill a mosquito with a bazooka. It doesn't make any sense. If you're driving a Tesla is they try to do their windshield wipers with a front camera that detects whether or not there's rain. You just use a standard humidity sensor. It does the job as well. You don't need a very complex neural network in the back to establish if it's raining or not. It's too much. And I think this starts with the companies. They can easily take a step back when they are working on this. At the same time, we have to realize that those big tech companies also have a very important role in pushing the hype. They want there to be this hype as well, because that is in their own interest. But at the same time, companies do have a responsibility to apply this technology responsibly. And in the end, it doesn't benefit if they push solutions like ChatGPT, and they say like ChatGPT is the solution to everything. Okay, that might work in the short run, but people will figure out that ChatGPT is not a miracle solution. It's just a large language model, and is not a very good knowledge base at all. Like it doesn't care whether or not what it gives you back is correct or not. It's a language model. It generates text. People will figure that out. So for your long term growth, it's actually more healthy to focus on the real value added rather than overhyping anything. But this keeps coming back with all emerging technology, sadly.
So maybe to kind of like wrap this up, I'm still curious if you see some, I wouldn't say even guidelines, but how do you see this moving forward in the next year or two? What are the things that should happen in order to start at least having a conversation in the right direction?
Well, we have the good news is that this discussion has started, and I think people are more aware about the energy consumption potential of AI, and that it can become a significant contributor to global data center electricity consumption, which is already growing as a whole. Even regular data center hardware is going to consume more power in the coming years. yeah, I just hope that policymakers are paying attention to this discussion. I mean, we can be talking about it, but I hope that in the background, some politician is listening in and thinking like, oh, hey, maybe this is something I should be asking questions about and perhaps maybe doing something with. Because ultimately, if we really want to take proper actions, we do need better data, not just estimates on loose foundations, but really solid numbers. And the only way to get that is through policy. And then, of course, we would have to follow up on that later on. But I think the logical first step would really, let's try to increase transparency first of all.
Absolutely, and I think we have completely circled back to what was the initial of this conversation, is get back to the data, right? Because that is the foundation, and then after that, establishing indeed a level playing field and transparency is something that then we can, as society, take decision on and make assessments and regulation potentially. So absolutely, I think it was a great wrap up. Alex, thank you very, very much for this conversation. It was a real pleasure.
Very welcome.
Thank you very much for listening in. If you enjoyed the conversation, remember to head to YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts for more insightful conversation revolving around XR and AI. And if you like the show, please leave a rating on Spotify. It really helps me keep doing this and shine the spotlights on the latest and greatest founders and creative in XR and AI. Till next time.